Welcome to The World This Week here on France 24, dissecting the big stories of the week for you, four of the sharpest editorial minds in the business, and me. They are, in London, Nico Hines, world editor of The Daily Beast. Nico, thank you very much for joining us. Great to see you, sir. Here in the studio, two voices of reason, each very much with a mind of their own. Vivian Welt of Time magazine. Great to see you, Viv.
Thank
Looking
you.
splendid as usual. And Patrick Smith of the Africa Report. Great to see you too, sir.
Good to
and
see
joining
you.
us from Newcastle, Judah Grunstein of the World Politics Review. Judah, small question. Is this Newcastle on Tyne or Newcastle under Lyme or another Newcastle you're in?
It's Newcastle on Tyne.
Well, I hope you're managing the accent because it's really good, isn't it? Great to see you, sir.
Tough for a foreigner to understand.
Away the lads, as they say. Judah, thank you very much indeed. Let's start with the Winter Games now underway. An anti-COVID bubble, of course, is in place for good reason. The opening ceremony has been impressive, to say the least. Diplomatic action, too, has been as important. Vladimir Putin, the VIP visitor, at a time when Russia's president is in the eye of another storm, that of the Ukraine conflict. We'll start with you, Viv, because you're here alongside me. This issue, Putin going to Beijing. How are you reading the whole situation there? Because we're seeing sport taking place, but of course the politics very much prominent, isn't it?
Yes, even though the International Olympic Committee head, Thomas Bach, just said that the Olympics has nothing to do with politics. Of course, we know it has everything to do with politics. Here we have really the only major world leader that actually is in Beijing. And I think it's a very clear statement that this is really about geopolitics. It's about a reordering of the global power structure. You have 2 out of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, and they are very much aligned against the other 3 major leaders that didn't show up in Beijing. So I think it's very clear they have a lot to gain from each other in terms of a strategic alliance and energy alliance. They made big oil deals, most important for China, and most important for Russia. If Russia is possibly facing the prospect of being cut off from the European market, he has a massive market in China, clearly.
Indeed. Let's bring in Nico Hines from London. Nico, I hope you can hear us, and I'm sorry I cut you off in the introduction. In my haste to introduce all the guests, I apologise for that, sir. What's your take on what's happening in Beijing right now? Obviously, sport is happening, a lot of politics too.
Yeah, I don't think the people involved in the politics care too much about the sport, and I think the people involved in the sport wish they didn't have to care about the politics, but it's not always that simple. The Daily Beast ran a story this morning about 3 of the top IOC members having deep, previously unreported business links to China, and I think this spectre is hovering over all of this. Of course, if it's your entire life to push a bobsled down a hill and this is the apex of your career, then I understand why that might seem more important to you, and fair enough if you're not going to speak out and have yourself thrown out of the games. But I think for the vast majority of these people and the people running the sports teams, they really ought to try and take a more holistic approach. And I think it is a real shame that the teams seem to be going on as though it is a real ordinary Olympics.
Indeed. Talk about ordinary Olympics, of course. But Patrick, I'll bring you in here. 2008 was when the Summer Games was staged in Beijing. I was fortunate enough to cover it for France 24, and we were all treated very well, as we expected to be treated, because it was a showcase thing for China. And we tried to sort of report on things socially in a degree, but we were tracked everywhere, and that's kind of what we expected. This time, China's approach, would you say it's slightly different as to how they look at it?
Well, because of the politics, the geopolitics, as Viv has said, because of COVID and I was listening to one delegation of athletes saying they spent all their time being briefed on not annoying Chinese officials with any political comments and sticking to COVID protocols. But I think the history bit is instructive. China is the first country to have both the summer and the winter Olympics in its capital. So that's breaking ground. So that's an interesting decision that the IOC went ahead with that. And I think a lot of questions about the IOC, particularly after its handling of the Peng Shuai incident, the star tennis player who disappeared after making an accusation against a senior member, in fact, the Deputy Secretary General of the Communist Party, I think. But then just on the history, go back to 1980. when the Olympic Games were in Moscow. Who was boycotting then?
The United
None
States.
other than Jimmy Carter and the US. Because what had Russia done? It had invaded Afghanistan. It had sent its army into Afghanistan, and it was told, given 1 month to get out. Maybe the American army wished someone had said that to them. You've got 1 month to get out, and 20 years ago. So I think those parallels, and I'm sure that remembering that, because Vladimir Putin would have been a young man at that time, KGB case officer probably in Germany at the time, must have been rather having a bit of a joke with Xi Jinping. I've seen it all. We went through this in the Soviet Union. You know, they all boycotted us. Don't worry about it. It'll be fine. You know, it's just you and me, and we're against the world. But we've got these. We're loyal comrades together, and I think that's the message they've been trying to say with this.
Indeed.
But
putting their heads together completely. You know, sport and politics.
it was absolutely fused. Yeah,
Completely
yeah,
fused.
as far as they're concerned.
Olympics
yeah.
1936, Moscow Olympics
Well,
1980.
I think
LA 84.
that would be a bridge too far for both of them, the 36
Sure.
Olympics. But the 1981, I think, would stick in the mind as them against. But I think also just there are some points of difference. This the argument over, Xi Jinping didn't give wholehearted support for what Putin is doing in Ukraine. He said, yes, no eastward expansion of NATO, because that's a strategic aim of both Beijing and Moscow. But they steered away from all the controversial stuff, like the clashes between India and China on the border, the clashes between Russian forces and Ukraine, and so on, South China Sea. I think they neatly skirted around some serious points of difference. But at the end of the day, it did the job. And as I think you pointed out, it's the money as well. That if Putin is going to go ahead with the Ukraine plan and face sanctions, he's going to have that fallback position if he has a much closer commercial and economic strategic relationship with China.
Indeed, as we were saying, that gas deal opens up another nice money stream, doesn't it, for Putin when he needs it most. Let me bring in Judah, who's waiting for us in Geordieland, Newcastle upon Tyne. Judah, sport and politics is kind of the theme what we're on here, I suppose. In terms of what we saw in the torch carrying, for instance, a Uyghur among those carrying the flame.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I would argue that, Mark, you mentioned the 1936 Olympics. Patrick mentioned the 1980 Olympics, but then in between there was the Cold War Olympics, where face-offs between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, or the Western Bloc and the Soviet Bloc, the Olympics were yet another arena for competition between the two systems, and to show which one developed the best athletes, for instance, and which one had the most social justice and things like that. So I would argue, in fact, that since the Cold War, the absence of this sort of geopolitical element in the games has been almost like a parenthesis that's the exception, not the rule. So you have not only the 1980 Miracle on Ice, and you have the 1972 basketball final between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, but then you have other sort of often forgotten sort of Cold War era geopolitics, where you had I think it was the Hungarian water polo team face off against the Russian water polo team, or the Soviet Union water polo team, in the finals of the 1956 water polo competition in the Olympics, which they called blood in the water because the pool was pink when they got out. So there's always been this geopolitical element to the games. We already saw it emerging quite a bit in the past, I'd say 2 or 3 Olympics, as the U.S.-China strategic rivalry became something prominent in people's minds. And now, with everything going on the border of Ukraine, it adds even more of that Cold War era flavor, which, for all the anxiety, it adds quite a bit more drama to the proceedings. So as much as the athletes might regret it, it does add some drama for the viewers. I'd just add one more thing in terms of this contrast between 2008 and today for China. In a lot of ways, I think it was said that 2008 was almost like China's coming out party. where it introduced itself as this modernized, transformed country to a global audience that really saw it as a low-skilled factory to the world country. And so that was a real eye-opener. And now today, it's a different kind of coming out. It's a coming out of China as not rising China, but risen China. China that is a global power, that expects to be taken on its own terms, to set the agenda, not follow it. And so I think you see that with the run-up to the Olympics and the stakes that Xi Jinping has put on the Olympics this year. So all those things, I would say, make it an Olympics that are fascinating to watch, that I think we'll look back on as something of a benchmark or a measure to compare with future events.
Indeed, Judah, thank you very much indeed. Vivian Watt, I'll bring you back in. We talked about the coming out party 2008, now 2022, the coming of age, another way of describing it perhaps. Where do you see it going from there? I mean, certainly...
Okay, well, I mean, I think that, and I just want to pick up with a little bit what Nico said. I think leaving aside the fact that, of course, we're going to have the Olympics in 2 years' time, right here in Paris, and after that 4 years later in Los Angeles. But by and large, the Olympic movement, as they like to call themselves, is really struggling to find locations to hold these Olympics. They are massive white elephants. They're hugely expensive. By and large, people who the voters hate them. And what you are left with more and more are these rather authoritarian countries, Russia, China. They're prepared to spend whatever it'll take to host these Olympics. It is more and more of a propaganda exercise, sadly so, because I love the sports. But the sports are, I think, will be more and more overshadowed by these issues because of what ultimately the Olympic organization is. It is a political movement. Sports are very firmly organized on nationalistic lines. Everybody walks in with their national flag. And, the greatest irony is that actually the Russian athletes are not allowed to compete under their national flag right now because they were found guilty of having doped their athletes. The only major world leader there is the leader of a country who actually officially is not part of the Olympics.
Indeed, thank you. Final word on this one from Nico in London, where the Olympics, I think, Nico, are still very much, fondly remembered from when they took place under Boris Johnson's then remit as London Mayor.
Yeah, it's an interesting point about the kind of white elephant factor. And when London was going to hold it, it set out really strongly, and it really made it part of the bid in the first place, that we will not become a white elephant. This won't be, we won't make the same mistakes. And one of the things that they did, which kind of sounds wasteful, but in some senses is less embarrassing, is they put up quite a few temporary stadiums, which then came down. So you haven't got these kind of empty, deserted, cracked arenas, which you see dotted all over the world. And it is still a work in progress, but there's a fantastic swimming pool that's well used over there in Hackney. There is a Olympic Stadium, which is used by the West Ham football team. So that's used pretty much every other week. And although people thought it would be a useless football stadium to start with, it's actually kind of coming into its own. But when we're still waiting to see, basically, because there's going to be a new V&A over in East London. There's going to be a new part of the university. There's going to be a new part of London Fashion School. It still remains to be seen, but it may end up being a positive, strong legacy over here. And perhaps that will help change other countries' minds going forward, and we can avoid having all these Olympics in Saudi Arabia for decades to come.
Indeed, that part of London that we're talking about, I lived there once upon a time before all the Olympic investment. It's pretty grim, but now it looks pretty smart, I think. And like you say, West Ham playing at the London Stadium adds a bit of class to it as well, which is very nice. Nico, thank you very much indeed. There is a link between, of course, what we're talking about here in the Winter Olympics and our next topic, Ukraine. Just how real is the threat of war is where we're starting. If you're living along the border between Ukraine and Russia, the answer, of course, it's very realistic. Let's hear now from Vladimir Zelensky, Ukraine's president.
Не буде, а буде, на жаль, There will be a tragedy if the escalation begins.
проти нашої держави. І тому
It will not be a war between Ukraine and Russia.
Війна України з Росією. Це буде війна в Європі, повномасштабна.
It will be a full-scale war in Europe.
Більше своїх територій і людей. Дякую.
Vladimir Zelensky, president of Ukraine. 120,000 Russian troops then on the border between Ukraine and Russia. There are more Russian troops in Belarus too. Well placed, just in case. Let's hear now from Mircea Joanna, the NATO Deputy Secretary General.
We will not get involved militarily in Ukraine. We support Ukraine in many other ways. Individual allies do support Ukraine. And in order to deter Russia from doing that, what we have to do, and that's something we do, I would say, in an impeccable way, both in NATO, both in the EU, between G7 countries, is to really demonstrate to Russia and to the leadership in the Kremlin that in a cost-benefit analysis, an additional military intervention against Ukraine is a net loss for Russia.
Interview in full in our Talking Europe programme. Staying with our topic, John Kirby, the US defence spokesman, warning earlier that the United States is increasing troop numbers in Eastern Europe, ready to respond.
It's important that we send a strong signal to Mr. Putin and, frankly, to the world that NATO matters to the United States. It matters to our allies. And we have ironclad Article 5 commitments. An attack on one is an attack on all.
Let's bring in our guests. Vivian, may I start with you? War or jaw? Is it all talk or is something sadly going to happen, do you think?
You know, part of me, of course, the prospect of a war in Ukraine is horrific to us sitting here in Europe. I mean, it's an enormous country. It's strategically placed, you know, in the most, you know, extreme way in the middle of Europe. On the other hand, a part of me thinks Putin has played this so brilliantly. He has the West exactly where he wants them. They're completely confused about what he's going to do. They don't know what his motivations are. They could be in this kind of limbo situation for months or years to come. They're deploying troops, they're deploying, you know, resources, brain power, everything, on really an abstract war that has yet to happen. I think the problem for Putin, obviously, is how to back out of this. But I think for America, they also have a problem. You had Secretary of State Tony Blinken a couple of weeks ago casting this as being, you know, the defining battle for the soul of the West or the soul of a democracy. And I had to kind of think, what, you know, really? For Americans, this is the line in the sand? It just sounded very unconvincing.
Judah, can I bring you in on this one? Judah Grunstein, there up in northern England. In terms of what we were saying there, sort of the idea of the US involvement in all of this, of course, it's very clear from what the spokesman Kirby was saying that there is a kind of a readiness to respond, they're saying.
Well, I think it has to be taken in its right measure. And I would disagree a little bit with what Viv said. You know, the U.S. is responding with 3,000 troops, 2,000, if I'm not mistaken, that are already in Europe. So it's really a redeployment as much as it's a deployment. They're going to countries that Putin did not want U.S. troops in. That was one of his stated concerns, at least, that he doesn't want NATO troops in these Eastern European member states. This was sort of floated as a response to a potential invasion as a cost, and now it's even being carried out preemptively. I would say that in terms of cost, Putin, for now, has incurred the greatest cost. It's not cheap to station 120,000 troops that far away from their bases, move them all over there with the equipment, prepare the logistics, support them over there in what amount to basically encampments. This is all really, really expensive, and he's had them there for the most part of a year. And I would argue more that in some ways Putin has backed himself into a corner. He has basically gotten the response that he didn't want. He now faces options that are all pretty unattractive. The first is backing down. He could try to save some face. He could try to use some of the diplomatic channels that have been opened up, whether it's France or the Normandy format or anything, to say, well, we've gotten some concessions. He might say, well, this was just a routine exercise anyway, and look at the West, how they overreacted. We never had any intention to invade, and that might be the truth. We won't know whether we've deterred an actual invasion or whether there never was one to begin with. Those are both going to be complicated for him. Even less attractive would be an actual invasion, because I think that even though the Russian military has overwhelming superiority to the Ukrainian military, the fact of the matter is that when you look at some of the force postures that are required for recent occupations, it's actually a pretty thin amount of troops for the size of Ukraine and the amount of troops that Ukraine has, the potential for an insurgency or urban warfare. So there's that. Let's say that there is something, let's call it catastrophic success, and the government in Kiev falls, and Russia becomes responsible for governing and occupying and governing Ukraine. That's a huge commitment of resources, of the military power and personnel, but also non-military personnel. It creates a huge vacuum of stability right on Russia's border that it wanted to avoid. So I don't think an invasion is necessarily that attractive to Putin at this point. He hasn't gotten anything that he's wanted. He might have thought he would get some more divisions within NATO and within the West. That hasn't happened. The response, sure, Germany has been a weak spot. Italy has been silent. People have been dragged along kicking and screaming. But the fact is, when you look at the NATO response in writing, when you look at the U.S. response in writing, and when you look at the preemptive and punitive actions that the West is willing to take, they're pretty robust. And NATO has not divided at all. So in reality, if Putin decides to invade, the costs for Ukraine will still be enormous, the human costs. But I don't think necessarily that Putin has set himself up for a grand success here. To the contrary, I think he's looking at some pretty bad options all around.
Okay, I'm wondering about Europe's position, because I've read some notable brains on this story talking about Putin really sort of short-circuiting Europe, going straight to Washington with his negotiation, again going to Xi Jinping the way he's gone. Can I just bring another guest in on this one, Judah, and maybe turn to Patrick? What do you make of Europe's position right now?
Well, I think, as Judah said, that he's miscalculated. That's evident. And the one thing he was banking on was a divided Western response. And the weird thing is that he's got a united Western response for probably the first time in about 10 years, from the organization President Emmanuel Macron dismissed as brain dead. Somehow it's come together. It's come together because America has decided that however it's going to rebalance forces in the emerging geopolitics, it's going to keep NATO together, and it wants to keep, and it's the command and control of NATO. It's the main financier of NATO and provider of equipment. And once Biden had, held that in his hand and then dealt with Germany, France, Britain, Italy, and decided to pull it all together, I think that really wasn't what Putin had expected. So I think that's his first problem. I mean, there are still question marks. There is obviously a difference of view between Berlin and Paris and London. London, as ever, is sort of tailoring its response to what its interests are with Washington's the relationship with Washington and so on. But essentially, I think it's been a defeat for Putin in terms of the diplomatic side of it, and I think he needs some sort of off ramp. Having said that, but I think I would just everyone's talking about, is there going to be a war or isn't? I think we should remember that there is a war. There already has been a war. There was a seizure of territory in Crimea, and since then there's been a war in which thousands of people have been killed. Thousands of Ukrainians have been killed. But I mean the pros and cons of this war are not really straightforward. It's not like, Zelensky is the heroic nationalist leader that carries all before him and he's got his country fighting the evil Russian bear. There is a large pro-Russian constituency in Ukraine that thinks Zelensky's that he should have stuck with being a comedian and shouldn't have gone into politics. They've got no time for it before. And then there's a bunch of more than a bunch, a lot. Hundreds of millions of Ukrainian nationalists who think Zelensky's way too soft on Putin and way too naive. When he first came to power, very inexperienced, started negotiating with Putin and thinking that there was going to be some sort of common thought about how to proceed. And then you had the Minsk II treaty, which neither side has really implemented, and Putin's using that to open the whole question again. But I think, that the complexity of managing Ukraine, I think people underestimate how difficult Zelensky's position is. But I think the last thing is just that the complexity of all the other moving parts, Poland, the Baltic states, and everyone else. This is such a complex problem that it's not going to be simply Kiev versus Moscow. It is going to involve the whole of Europe. And I think it's a big commentary on where Europe is, that America has played such an outsized role in this. And it's, some said, Putin had wanted to dial direct to Washington, didn't want to bother with any of the European powers. And now he's been forced to confront the fact that all the Western European, and Central and Eastern European powers all feel they have an interest in this. And that's what's going to make it so complex to resolve, I think.
Patrick, thank you. Let's bring in Nico for a final word on this one. Emmanuel Macron heading to Moscow and Kiev. What kind of message do you think he'll take? What do you think he'll be looking for, Nico?
Well, I don't think he should be going to Moscow, probably at all. He certainly shouldn't be going to Moscow before he goes to Kiev to get his lines in order with Zelensky, which is what the Europeans should be doing. I mean, I'm very pleased that you guys all sound so happy that this crisis has been averted and we can all stop worrying about it and go to the pub. But I have to say I'm completely baffled. Vladimir Putin seized Crimea just 7 years ago, and everyone said, oh, if he does that, there's going to be huge comeuppance, he's going to be in all sorts of trouble, he won't be able to live this down, he'll be made a pariah. And he just waltzed in there and took it, and nobody did a damn thing. He's basically got undercover troops and militias that he backs already, as Patrick was saying, already in eastern Ukraine, who have set up these two de facto independent states in the east of the country. I just don't see why anybody thinks that if Putin were to either using undercover people like the Wagner Group, and we've reported that Wagner troops in Africa are pulling out to go to Ukraine. We've reported that some of the nastiest elements of the Wagner Group have been hinting that they're going into Ukraine. I just don't see this cause for optimism at all. I think there's a very good chance that if Putin decided to go into Ukraine tomorrow, next weekend, that he would do so with very little resistance, absolutely zero military input from NATO. And everyone would tear their hair out and say how awful it was. And after 6 months, people would say, oh, well, what are we going to do about it? Europe's entirely reliant on Russia for its gas supply, and that's not going to change anytime soon. I'm slightly baffled by everyone's relaxed attitudes, but hopefully you're all right.
Mark, can I just respond real quick before we
Real quickly before we move on to West Africa and Mali. Go ahead, Judah.
Absolutely. I just want to say to Nico that I agree, and I'm not suggesting that I'm optimistic. I think this problem with Russia, even if he tomorrow pulls all the troops back, the problem with Russia is a long-term problem for Europe and for the United States. And I don't think. I'm not at all optimistic. I think that if there is a war, it'll be incredibly destructive. I don't agree that there won't be any response. I think that this will be a before and after. I don't think it will be as easy to go back to the before and act as if nothing happened. And I expect there to be, if not an iron curtain in Europe, but some sort of softer version of a curtain in Europe between what Vladimir Putin has influence over and what he doesn't.
NATO,
so I'm not necessarily optimistic at all.
Hear what you're saying,
but I
Judah.
just don't think necessarily an invasion will be a cakewalk for Russia or Putin. Certainly not if you look 5 years down the line or 10 years down the line, as you would have to with the U.S. in Iraq or Afghanistan.
Judah, thank you very much indeed. Any thoughts? Shall we move on? Let's move on. We'll move on. Okay. Mali serving notice on the French ambassador this week to leave the country. New low in Franco-Malian relations amid the seeming disintegration of French influence in the Sahel region of Africa, with the influence of Russia and China set to fill that void left by the end of Operation Barkhane. We've already mentioned the Wagner mercenaries in our previous topic, and they're actually sort of central to this one as well. France 24's Reporters programme has a focus on the whole situation, and I think we can show you an extract of that.
It is January 22nd and a new day of protests in the streets of Bamako. A week ago, hundreds of thousands of Malians took to the streets across the country to denounce the regional sanctions imposed on their nation. This gathering was organized by a hardcore nationalist group made up of young people. Here, there is plenty of anti-French sentiment.
I'm really happy. All this patriotism inspires me. I'm really proud of the Malian people and proud of the African people.
The crowd of thousands marches around the city, growing by the hour.
Bring in Patrick Smith to get some comments on this one. Patrick, we're seeing there really people very much angry towards France. People in Mali, they're angry towards France. A report there by Cyril Payan, our reporter. I noticed even a placard criticising France 24. You know, so obviously we will show that. We'll discuss everything, which is our duty to do so, and that's what we're doing tonight. What is your sense of what's really happening there in Mali?
Well, I think it's multi-layered. This was a coup. One of three colonels' coups in West Africa over the past year. So the new leader of Mali, Colonel Goita, organized his putsch not just against the civilian government, but also against the generals, you know, who are in their 50s and 60s and are the old guard. And they presided over a corrupt and inefficient security response. So for those of you, you know, familiar with the situation in the Middle East where you had jihadist insurgencies there, Mali and Burkina Faso and Niger have faced these same issues and with increasing power. So while Islamic State and Daesh have been pushed out of Syria and Iraq, they've set up these bases in West Africa and in the Horn of Africa. So that's what the Mali army was up against, and it was failing badly. And the jihadist fighters are targeting the resource areas, the gold mines. They're charging people tax revenues. They're occupying large swathes of the country, both in Mali and Burkina Faso and in parts of Niger now. And people feel betrayed. They felt betrayed by their own army. They felt betrayed by their own civilian government, and they didn't believe that France was helping the situation at all. And that's where this is coming from. I mean, essentially the security has failed, and you layer that on top of broken economies. A lot of the economies in the Sahel have just never recovered from the effects of the 2008 financial crisis, what that did to the commodities and what that did to their commodity earnings and access to finance and everything else. So you've got this socio-economic, political security crisis going on that's been getting worse and worse and worse. And the governments in place in the Sahel, particularly Burkina and in Mali, have not been dealing with the problem. And so that's why there's a sense of relief in Goita, in Mali, in Doumbouya, in Guinea, and Miba in Burkina Faso. They're probably saying the same thing. We're young, we're dynamic, and these are well-educated, well-trained soldiers. They've got experience in several different arenas, and they've got a plan, and it all sounds very good, except no one believes they're just going to stay for a couple of months to find out, find the best civilians with a plan to take over. They're going to try and stick around as long as they possibly can. And I think that's where the difficulty is going to be. If they don't make progress within 6 months against the insurgents, and it's going to be difficult for them to do that, I think they're going to lose popular support and they're going to have a different sort of crisis on your hand. People are going to look around, well, what can we trust now? These guys came in there, they were saviors, they failed. So what's going wrong here?
Indeed. Patrick, thank you. We've kind of bring you in. France, as we saw in the extract from the documentary that we're going to show over this weekend, in for a lot of criticism. Is that fair?
Well, in some ways, yes. But, there's so many, I shouldn't say indigenous, there's so many issues that are basically, leaving aside France, intrinsic to that region. The region is awash in weaponry, for example, and it has been since the collapse of Libya, in which, this gigantic amount of weaponry just washed into the Sahel. And we've seen the effects of it. 10 years later, we are still seeing the effects of that. Patrick mentioned the collapse of these economies, which have just been exacerbated, obviously, by the pandemic. They've also been exacerbated by Europe's increasingly tough immigration rules. You have this kind of build-up of tremendous economic pressure and people who face nowhere to go. Whereas before they might have had somewhere to go. They don't anymore. And that might also, I guess, tap into the sense that France has basically not been their friend in this.
Indeed. Operation Barkhane, of course, Emmanuel Macron announcing it's winding down back in, I think it was June when he made the announcement. This is all ongoing. Since then, of course, there's been a rush to replace, and part of that has been the rumoured, although that rumour is increasingly firming up, about Wagner's mercenaries, Russian mercenaries being involved on the ground. Nico Heinz, can I bring you in for a further comment on this one? I mean, your reading of the situation, please. France, as we've been discussing, got a lot of things wrong. Was the nature of Operation Barkhane just wrong in its aims?
Well, I think when you're a former colonial power, there's always going to be huge issues. And if you're trying to maintain a modern, aggressive army in a country that you used to have control over, that is now independent, that's always going to bring up huge issues. And I think everything that Vivian and Patrick said is absolutely right. There are all these conditions at play to make these some of these democracies vulnerable to this sort of thing. But I do think, at the risk of returning to Putin again, I do think that there's something else going on here. I don't think it's a coincidence that the people who carried out the coup in Mali, some of them had been trained just outside of Moscow in Russia and apparently came up with the plan for the coup in Russia, then came and prosecuted it. And lo and behold, we're going to see Wagner brought in to deal with these terrorist threats.
And that's going to cost a lot more than using French troops, isn't it, Nico? Using Wagner. It's going to cost them a lot more.
Well, exactly. Wagner are not doing this for a favour. The French may be doing it out of some sort of post-colonial guilt, and also, obviously, for good geopolitical reasons as well, trying to tamp down kind of growing terror threats. But essentially, they were doing it, as a benevolence, whereas Wagner have got very different interests. They will want to be repaid with access to mining rights. With you're already seeing massacres and things happening in some of these nations where Wagner are operating that coincidentally seem to be right near mines. And there are big question marks about what they're up to. The coup in Burkina Faso, was that 2 weeks ago now? Reported by our West Africa correspondent Philip Obaji. The last conversation that the coup plotter had with the president was saying, we need to bring the Wagner forces in to look after the terrorists. The president said no. The next time he saw him, he was declaring that he was no longer president on the television. So I think there is more than just these economic forces bubbling up. I think there's a concerted plan by Putin's chef, Yevgeny Prigozhin, to actually try and help these coups, foment these uprisings in order to cement Russian power. And it's alarming.
Nico, thank you. Final word on this one. Final word of the program goes to Judah. Over to you, sir.
Well, I would say that I agree with Nico. I don't think it's possible to dismiss Russia and Wagner's hand in some of what's going on. I guess I'd go back to what Patrick said about this being multi-layered, and your question about did France do things wrong, or I think that what we have right now is the culmination of decades of failed policy, both domestic within the region, but also international, especially with France. It's really hard to distinguish the boundary between France and some of these countries in terms of anything but immigration. And that goes for security, that goes for business interests, that goes for the governments that France and the international community were propping up in the region. That goes for the institutions that have been hollowed out and that just don't function in a way that meets the needs of their populations. And so I think what we're seeing right now is sort of a bankrupt system, and the check is coming due, and the check is in the sharp end of the check is these Islamist insurgencies, but there's also this unemployment. There's also corruption. These are very wealthy countries. It's just that the wealth has been expropriated or collected at the top. So I think that, for instance, the emblem of this to me is the Operation Barkhane. It's similar to the U.S. and Afghanistan. It's the French military involvement directly in Mali now goes back to 2013, I believe. So we're at almost a decade, and it's nowhere closer to achieving its goals now than it was when it started. And yet it's ultimately going to take the Malian junta throwing France out for France to sort of come to its senses and say, wait, this wasn't working.
Judah,
but neither was rushing to elections working, rushing to elections that without democratic institutions, training the colonels, because France also trained some of these officers as well, training them and then watching them as they take over governments. So the final word that I would have is that this is the entire system. It's a condemnation of the entire system, so that if Wagner could come in and tip one domino and then see the whole region go over like this, which I'm not convinced is happening, but if it were the case, it means there wasn't
Judah,
really
I need to cut you off. Time is against us, I'm afraid. Sorry to cut you off, so I hate doing that, but we're running out of time. Thank you, Judah of the World Politics Review. Judah Grunstein, thank you very much indeed. Thanks to Patrick Smith of the Africa Report, thanks to Vivian Walt of Time Magazine, and thanks to Nico Hines, world editor at The Daily Beast, joining us from good old London. And thanks to you all for watching too. This is The World This Week on France 24. Stay with us.